Dear colleagues, dear students, Your Excellency, we have today extraordinary events. We meet in our university the ambassador of Republic of France, Vesьєrом. In our university, for our university is very big proud the visit of ambassador of France. You know that France very helpful for our country in this very difficult time for Ukraine. Somewhat about Mr. Ambassador. Vesьєrом graduated from the Higher School of Economics and Commerce, the Paris Institute of Political Studies, and also obtained a bachelor degree in history from the University of Paris 4. Before his appointment to Ukraine, he served as an ambassador of Republic of France to the Republic of Croatia from 2019 to 2023. From 2017 to 2019, he held the position of Head of Ministry of Service of European Affairs, later becoming Secretary of State of European Affairs. Having joined the diplomatic service in 1997, he was appointed twice to the Parliament representation of France of the European Union, notably as a speaker and head of press service. He also headed the European Union External Relations Service at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Additionally, as a technical advisor in the Office of Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin, he was responsible for relations with the European Union countries, the Balkans, the Eastern Europe, served as a commissioner to the Director of Department of Policy and Security at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and worked as a negotiator advisor at France's permanent mission in UN in New York. Vesьєrом also held the position of Deputy Director of Commissioners and Press Department at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is a Knight of National Order of Merit. Your Excellency, with honor I invite to the lecture, and dear colleagues, we have very interesting lecture about transformation diplomacy, diplomacy in modern context of war aggression, military aggression against our country. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rector, for these kind words. I will speak in English, mais je veux quand même saluer ceux d'entre vous qui comprendraient le français, but I will continue in English. And sorry not to be able to do that in Ukrainian. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be with you today. We know and we appreciate the impact of your Institute of Polytechnic on Ukraine and in science. The fact that it was the alma mater of Igor Sikorsky himself, but also Sergei Korolev or Evan Patton, all renewed engineers and scientists, is of course very important for us. We are impressed by the way, including under your leadership, Mr. Rector, this institution managed to turn from a Soviet-style institution to a modern institute with deep investment on applied science and fostering linkage with key economic sectors which contribute significantly to the war efforts since 2022 and the full-fledged Russian aggression. Your institute is a top academic and research institution, but another good reason for me to be with you today is that you have strong links with French counterparts, including the École Polytechnique, which is nearly the same name as you, which is actually a symbol of a French system. It was created by Napoleon Bonaparte more than 200 years ago, and with the École Nationale Supérieure de Technique Avancée, but also with the École Centrale de Lyon. So you are resilient, you are able to innovate, you are able and you are learning how to change patterns, to think out of the box, and to bring adapted solutions to the current context, and to adapt yourself to the new reality. So after this, I was asked, in fact, to speak today about how diplomacy is forced to reinvent itself in the face of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. Of course, what I'm going to provide you with is only a personal vision, and please, I understand that we will have time for exchange after this, so it's a starting point, it's not an end game. Just a word about diplomacy, because after all, I understand that this is not your main topic here in this institute. And I will start by a word from my former master, Gérard Haro, who used to be our ambassador in Washington. Actually, Gérard Haro is a polytechnician himself before joining diplomacy, so that may be a career path for you, actually, if you would be interested. Actually, he makes the distinction of the difference between foreign policy and diplomacy. Foreign policy is a public policy. What are the targets that France, for example, or Ukraine, or whichever, wants to achieve? What are our interests? What do we believe in, our values, etc., and so on and so forth. Diplomacy is the way that it is implemented, and diplomats are the ones who are mainly supposed to implement that policy. So it's quite technical in reality, diplomacy. This said, reinvention and diplomacy are two notions that do not go along naturally very well. Because to make a long story short, there is a traditional figure in literacy of ridiculous diplomats, maniacally attached to old forms, such as the Marquis de Norpois in Proust, La Recherche du Temps Perdu, for those of you who like literature. And there is something true in this, and that is that diplomacy is mainly about tradition and about certain forms, which tends to give the impression that diplomats are traditionally maybe more conservative than the main part of the society. However, it is mainly based on the fact that diplomacy is a common language inherited from the past, but understood by all the diplomats between each other, and this is why it evolves quite slowly. However, diplomacy is able to adapt, and actually it must adapt when the stakes are incredibly high, and this is the situation we are in. So I will be short on this because all this is known, but of course it's a defining moment in international relations because of what Russia is doing here in Ukraine. It's a challenge for the whole international order, the one which was built after World War II. As you remember, there were different systems, Westphalia system, then the Vienna Congress system back in the 19th century, then alliances system before World War I and between World War I and World War II. But after World War II, there was a very different world with international organizations, the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council, the World Trade Organization, then the IMF, International Monetary Fund. All these rules and regulations with all the same idea that actually differences should be resolved peacefully, and that that would be the most efficient way. And actually, it was the case for a very long time. And there is one organization or one part of the world which thrives in this, and this is the European Union. The European Union was created specifically for this, to settle our differences. We are the continent where actually more blood was shed, certainly in the 19th and 18th century, and to be able to go through this through norms, norms for ourselves, but also norms for the others, because a power with 450 million and extremely wealthy people can actually impose their wealth and their norms. So for the EU, actually, fighting against the norms and fighting against the rules and imposing the rule of force, as Russia is doing, is an existential threat. It's true for small countries, it's true for big countries inside the EU, the same. And this is what Russia is doing since 2014 and even more since 2022, because actually it violates every and single rule of the Charter of the United Nations. To be completely truthful, Russia's war of aggression is not the only thing which threatens this traditional international relations system, but also other factors such as populism, anti-elite, demagogy, and so on and so forth. It started before, but certainly the Russian aggression and war of aggression towards Ukraine is definitely the most definitive expression of this. During my intervention, basically, there are a few points which will come back and again, but I would like to highlight first is that, of course, you could see diplomacy and military as two opposite activities. They are, to some extent, but of course, they have to work hand in hand, and diplomacy does not stop when the military begin. It has to go through, even though differently. Second, that diplomacy is of course mainly working between capitals and ambassadors and so on, but it is also addressing multiple channels towards working towards the same objective, and this is what we are doing here. Third, that there is a form of continuity of French diplomatic action, but at the same time, or EU action, but at the same time, there are pivotal moments where actually the system do change. And this is what happened towards Ukraine, and we'll come back to that later. And lastly, there are discontinuity also in the use of technical means. I won't develop it today too much, but a bit. You may know that today in Paris there is a big summit on artificial intelligence. We'll say a few things about that. So first point is how Ukraine has transformed its own diplomacy, because of course, even if the phenomena are the same, the point of view is different whether you are the state which is the victim or states which are trying to support you. Many things are traditional. Sometimes they are traditionally done, but in bigger scales. Sometimes they are completely new. Actually, there is a big effort which is to reinvent knowledge from the past, this knowledge being how diplomatic efforts have to be conducted in wartime, back with war efforts directly on the ground, and this is something which had been forgotten in Europe for some time, except from the Western Balkan wars. Actually, the balance between diplomacy and military is complicated. Diplomacy, you have to engage, you have to communicate, you have to convince. Military, sometimes you have to keep your mouth shut. A good example of that is the Kursk operation that the Ukrainian army did launch in August 2023. Absolutely nothing was said beforehand to the allies, and they were perfectly right, because then these kind of operations need secret. But then, of course, they need to explain why they are doing this and how friends and allies can support it. So I think that it was a good example of actually things being done in the right way. One word about, yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm confused in my notes, but it's okay. We'll find that. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. And of course, the aim of diplomacy is to get support, humanitarian, economics, military support. Ukraine has been incredibly effective in that. There are things which are more new. The first thing is that, of course, Ukraine has engaged into a huge effort into convincing partners, but which is not new, but globally. War is in fact also beyond Ukrainian borders, and it requires an engagement with a global and a commitment with the global South. There have been huge efforts made by Ukraine, including in Africa. For example, I don't know if you know, but Ukraine is planning to open 10 embassies in African countries. 7 at least have already been opened. And we supported Ukraine into organizing, for example, trips for African journalists to be able to cover and to explain to their own population what's happening here. So forging strong alliance is a win-win approach and not a zero-sum gain. And there are a new strategy. This is the EU strategy. Ukraine is on the way to joining the EU. And diplomacy inside the EU is very different from elsewhere, because it's not winning or losing. Actually, when you're a big country in the EU, you must learn to lose for the greater good to make sure that the EU interest will be the real winner. The EU interest right now is that, of course, Ukraine would win this war. Then there is public diplomacy, diversification of channels, the multiplication of impact, the role of the diasporas, who really are ambassadors of Ukraine outside the country, but also civil society, NGO, artists, Ukrainian businesses, as well in cities and regions of Ukraine. They are all engaged. There was a big meeting in Paris actually a few months ago with representatives of the cities and oblasts with my Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I think that this is extremely useful. More broadly, the idea is to engage the public directly, to speak to hearts and minds. It is extremely important to do so, even more because, of course, Russia on its side has entered into very active disinformation campaigns. So the role of the Ukrainian diplomacy, supported by its friends, is actually to answer to that and to counter it. And to do that globally, a bit everywhere, and to adapt to on each places on how to do this. You don't speak to the same way to African public or to French public or to German public. Doing this, there is also use for new tools and technological and scientific joint initiatives between Ukraine and its allies, including France. Notably in the fighting against disinformation, we are using new tools, in particular thing which is called Vejyerom in France, which enables us to detect the disinformation campaign, but also the attacks against our networks and infrastructures on the social networks. And we work together with the Ukrainian authorities and with others to try to strengthen our answer. So I come now to what we are doing, France, the EU, and all of our partners. Of course, first reaction was swift response using the classical available tools, humanitarian assistance, military aid. As you know, France is sending some equipment such as the famous Caesar cannons, and now the Mirage airplanes have arrived in Ukraine, and many other things. And we are engaging in the process in producing some weapons and doing some maintenance in operational conditions in Ukraine. We also strengthen, of course, our diplomatic presence, and the French embassy. It was a bit of surprise for me to realize when I arrived that, in fact, the total amount of the French presence in the embassy is 50% more than it was before the war. Obviously not the same people. We also decided to expand our leverage and our means. There is an Agence Française de Développement, so that's French development support abroad, which is not doing, of course, development, strictly speaking, in Ukraine, but helping cities to finance some infrastructure projects. A specific 200 million funds dedicated to the reconstruction of civilian infrastructure, specific actions to counter disinformation, and mention that, support to the Grain from Ukraine initiatives, and of course, additionally to what the state is doing, French regions and cities are involved. We have new tools, such as the Comprehensive Security Agreement signed on 16th of February 2024, which is the first of this scale signed with Ukraine for France, cooperation in defense industry, cybersecurity, intelligence, and protection of critical infrastructure. We also fight, as we never did in the past, as strongly against impunity to establish responsibility of Russia in war crimes and in crimes against humanity, including with some specific DNA techniques. And we participate into this fight against disinformation I already mentioned. Apart from these quite, tools and ways to do things, there have been some strong political shifts in our view towards this. We supported Ukraine since the first moment. The main shift for us was that before 2022, the French authorities' view was that Ukraine should not join the EU. And actually, on June 2022, the French president decided to change this policy. And since then, we have been the strong supporters of the accession of Ukraine to the EU, but also to NATO. And this is actually something where we have to work together. It's not always easy, in particular the NATO accession claim, but this is something that we should push together. As far as the EU, after the new elections in Poland, we also have reactivated the Weimar format, so that's France, Germany, and Poland, to work together and to support Ukraine together. Looking ahead, of course, we approach now the third anniversary of a full-scale invasion. Diplomacy remains crucial in creating the conditions for just and lasting peace and sustainable peace that would restore Ukraine's security and guaranteed sovereignty. The role of the ambassadors remain, of course, and their team will remain, of course, important, but actually we have to engage with all the capabilities I mentioned, but also with the direct public itself. Actually, everybody has in mind that some lessons were learned, that the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 did not provide for the guarantees that Ukrainians were rightfully expecting, and that we should be able, if that's the request of the Ukrainian government, of course, to provide something much more tangible in case there would be a ceasefire or a peace agreement, being entry into NATO, of course, because of Article 5, or some other forms of security guarantees, which would be robust enough, meaning with troops on the ground. We have to work together even more. We have to engage. We will be joint European partners. We will negotiate together in Brussels. Some of these negotiations are going to be difficult, in particular on agriculture, because we have very different systems. Still, we should go through this, and together we will certainly be stronger in agriculture, but also in nuclear. Our two countries are strong nuclear countries, civilian nuclear countries, and that would be very important in the Europe of the future. I see that time flies, so let's keep some time for questions. To finish, I would, however, like to mention that in the future, we also have to learn from the new context where we are. To tell the truth, in fact, we have been surprised by this change of paradigm, this change of world, the fact that the war could come back so easily in Europe. It brings us back to other periods of our history. In 1999, Paul Valéry wrote, "We civilizations, we now know that we are mortals." Well, we are mortals again now, it's perfectly clear. And Georges Semprún, after World War II, was writing about the paradox that Buchenwald was so close to Weimar, so Goethe so close to the concentration camp. And actually, this is also something which we have to think about. War is back on our continent. There would be no business as usual. This is not a parenthesis. Russia will remain a very complicated state, even after a potential agreement. So we need a stronger diplomacy, we need a more flexible diplomacy, and we need a diplomacy which will be even more linked with defense, security, and intelligence issues. To do all this, of course, the role of the civil society and the role of students and young professionals will be key to shape the new generation of leaders, innovators, policymakers, and diplomats. Because in many places in Europe, people do not see the relationship between them and defense. Actually, you have no choice but to see this. And you are spearheading the efforts of reacting, being adaptable, being agile. And I think that all Europe is actually impressed by the way you are doing this and by your dedication to continue your training on this. So France contributes to the development of a stronger Ukraine. We'll continue to support Ukraine on every possible way. And the French embassy supports a one-year scientific program and research on artificial intelligence between the team of your school and the École Polytechnique. One of our teachers is currently attending this summit in Paris. One last word about this summit in Paris, because this is what's happening now. It's a huge event co-presided by France and French president and India, more than 1,000 participants, 90 countries, 28, so nearly 30 chief of states and governments working about how to put artificial intelligence in service of a public service, what kind of regulation should be needed, if regulation should be needed, what does that mean about the future of work, what does that mean about culture and innovation, how can it be trusted, how can it be regulated and, if necessary, controlled. It means that the artificial intelligence is an object of diplomacy, a question of regulation, and tomorrow a question of negotiation. Actually, I understand that they are trying to get a text from this summit. It's not that easy. And of course, there are military implications which are obvious, including in Ukraine. To conclude, and final words, just to say that we should not despair from diplomacy and its ability to change. Actually, myself, when I was a young diplomat in 1997, when I entered into the Ministry of Foreign Service, when we were writing a diplomatic cable, we would print on a special piece of paper, we'll roll it and send it in a tube with a system of pressurized air. It was certainly very, very innovative at the end of the 19th century. In 1997, it was a bit outdated. We changed. And a final anecdote about Paul Cambon to illustrate this possibility of change. Paul Cambon was the French ambassador in London during 20 years at the beginning of the 20th century, and the architect of the famous Alliance Cordiale, the treaty between France and UK, basically against Germany, that was key for our security. He was negotiating the treaty with Lord Lansdowne, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in the UK system, and there was a translator. And at one point, at the very end, he asked Lord Lansdowne if he would agree to the treaty, and Lord Lansdowne said yes. And Paul Cambon didn't say anything, so after a while he turned to the interpreter and said, please translate. It was utterly ridiculous, but that was the rule at that time. I think that Paul Cambon would be very surprised to see a French ambassador doing this in French, in English, and not in French, here in Ukraine at the time of war. So it means that, yes, we can adapt and maybe even reinvent ourselves. So thank you very much for your patience, and I'm ready to take any questions.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for this interesting election. It's very important for our country, it's for Ukrainians and for our students and our staff to understand the position France in this situation. Russian aggression. Dear students, we have extraordinary possibility to discuss with Ambassador of France. Thank you. With ambassadors of France, and you can take questions to our guests. Please, who first? Dear Vice Rector, can I take possibility for our students? Okay. Okay. Who first? Oh, Professor, please. Віталій Бузань, професор. Okay. Okay.
How Ukraine should effectively use digital diplomacy, for example, social network, to deal with civil society, policymakers, and citizens of foreign countries to debunk some man-made myths or resist misinformation campaign and to persuade them continue support Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Should I?
Yes.
Okay, okay. So thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, it's a very good question. I must say that I am humbled by your question, because the truth of the matter is that Ukraine is a master in communication in general and in electronic networks communication. So that's the first thing. I think that what you are doing is very effective, very impressive. Maybe sometimes it is important to bring the techniques which can explain to the public the fakes that Russia is doing, because most of the time their communication is based on fakes or a mixture between real data and their own invention. For example, this afternoon I had a meeting with Alexei Chernyshov, Vice Prime Minister, and he was showing us, actually, the EU ambassadors, how there was an article from a Spanish newspaper, El País, which is very renowned and great article, about Ukrainians abroad, which was neutral and even positive towards Ukraine, and then how some Russian publications, newspapers, but then bolts actually managed to use a few sentences, to take them apart, to use them and to change them slightly, and to make a communication which, of course, was extremely detrimental for Ukrainian interest. So all this, I think, is we should all together teach the public, but also teach children, I think, and students on how to detect this kind of disinformation campaigns. So this is very important. There is one note of caution which always strikes me. Ukraine is so good at communication that people keep their phones all the time, even in very sensitive meetings where actually phones are not such a good idea. So there is this culture. And the other thing is there is this culture of using Telegram a lot. And it seems obvious that Telegram is maybe the less safe of the all unsafe public networks. But still, I understand that we all have habits and it's difficult to change. But
Thank you. And this question is very important for us because our university planned in this year to open educational program, digital diplomacy. Thank you. Thank you. Pavlo, sorry. From student, one question from student, please. Oh, thank you. After student, okay, dear professor.
Good day, Mr. I forgot how your name. Sorry.
good day to you, no problem.
You said about congression in Vienna Convention. You said about convention that was near after World War I and before World War II. And then you said about Yalta Convention. What do you think is bad on Yalta Convention? And what do you think we need to create new that will give peace of the world? Thanks.
Well, I had not mentioned Yalta Convention, but you did, but I'm happy to enter into this. Well, Yalta will remains the Yalta Congress, actually, and the agreement in Yalta at the end of World War II, or before the end of World War II, actually, remains as the symbol of decisions taken by big players without ever taking care of the will of the people, and without even taking care of the will of representatives of some other powers. In Yalta, you had US, UK, and you had, of course, Stalin at that point. So Yalta, I think, is not such a good memory. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that times have changed and people have changed. And maybe there are things which were acceptable publicly or politically by populations in 1944 after 5 years of war, and without all the social networks and so on, which now are not acceptable anymore. So I think that this way of doing diplomacy, I don't want to say that it cannot happen. Sometimes it must happen, but it cannot be enough. So of course, when you have to negotiate something, you have to negotiate quietly in some discreet place with a restricted group. That's for sure. Otherwise, you lead to nothing. But at some point, you need to be sure that all the players are on board and that the will of the people will be respected. I mean, there is no other modern way. Otherwise, you don't have a sustainable situation.
Thank you. Thank you. And Professor Coutu is the head of Department of Sociology.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thanks for coming to our university. Thanks for your lecture. And of course, we are extremely grateful to French government and French people for supporting Ukraine in these challenging and difficult times. In fact, my daughter attends French school in Kiev, under the Kiev. So I think she may have met you before us. But my question goes beyond education and science. I have two interrelated questions. And my department is implementing a program in conflict resolution and mediation. So we deal a lot of conflicts, local conflicts, regional conflicts, global conflicts. So my two questions, interrelated questions, are going to be dealing with these conflicting issues. First of all, France is famous well, for some people could be infamous for having French Foreign Legion. Do you think this experience could be useful for Ukraine, and Ukraine should develop something similar like Ukrainian Foreign Legion, given that we face this existential threat from Russia, and Russia is unlikely to disappear, and Russian threat is unlikely to disappear. So we need to be strong, and strong militarily. So do you think that French experience with Foreign Legion could be useful and relevant to Ukraine? And my second question is that, well, current war of Russia against Ukraine is not just war against Ukraine. To many pundits and policymakers, it's a direct challenge to the world order, to rule-based order. And as far as I know, France has experienced some issues with Russia in Africa. Like French interest in Africa has been challenged by Russians. So do you, kind of what's French strategy and what's French response to this challenge? And do you think Ukraine could offer a helping friend to French partners? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two very different questions. I'll start with the Foreign Legion in France. For those of you who would not know what this is, it was created I think more around 200 years ago, and it is a special unit of special regiments of French infantry with French officers, but the bulk of the troop is actually foreigners who enlist to serve a French army, and after, don't remember if it's 5 years or 8 years, after a certain number of years, if they are discharged honorably, they are able to get French nationality. It is of course an elite unit in our system doing elite missions, always with other regiments of the French army, never alone. And actually, of course it's a useful tool, but I don't think that at the end of the day this is the important thing for Ukraine, because what is really key for Ukraine is Ukrainians and the fantastic work that Ukrainians are doing. There is, and this leads me to maybe a broader question, but of course there is this question on what will happen after the war, whenever after the war will be, because Ukraine will be this country with an incredible military capability and experience. And the question is what to do with this. Should it be able to provide more security for the rest of NATO if it enters into NATO, for example, which would make actually a lot of sense, or should it be useful for other means, and how to help those people to come back to civilian life lives for the others. There is actually some foreigners serving into Ukrainian army. But I don't think that it's really comparable to the system that we do have. About your questions, definitely the second question, the war that Russia is leading against Ukraine is a war against the international order. It has global consequences, and we also see that in Africa because there are links. Actually, we are working with Ukraine, including in how to address the African public, as I explained. In Africa, the essence of what Russia is doing is to try to demonstrate that they are helping Africans to get really independent, and by getting rid of a former colonial power, namely France in some part of Western Africa, which is an extremely striking set of lies, because what happens in Ukraine actually demonstrates that Russia is the colonial power, and what they are trying to do here is a colonial initiative, by the way. So I think that it's extremely important for both of us to work together. On Africa, we are adapting our system. We used to have a system with lots of French military bases in some African countries. If it happens, and it happens that some of these countries do not wish us to stay, they are independent and sovereign states, so we leave. We also see that in some cases they have a Wagner group of other Russian paramilitary coming in, and we see that it destabilizes their own societies, but also the whole region. We can see that. We can denounce it. We can work with our friends and allies, ultimately we have to respect the will of the populations. So we have to find a way between those two sets of priorities and constraints.
Thank you. Mr. Styrenko, Vice Rector of Science, our university. Mr. Styrenko, last 3 weeks was in France, in École Polytechnique and the University Paris 8, and he had a fresh impression and good experience to collaborate with French University. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for support of Ukraine second time. And for me, very important that a few days ago was announced that Ukraine received a few air fighters in Ukraine. I am former pilot. That is very important for me, for my classmate. Thank you very much for this. And secondary, thank you very much for your warm words about our collaboration with École Polytechnique and INSTA as well. So we really have big plans in this, in artificial intelligence and embedded system fields. I think this collaboration was very fruitful for our institution. But my question is, what is your opinion about European Union security system after this horrible war, when Ukraine win in this field and European Union will include Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, you're right to frame the question like this. We all wish, we all need victory for Ukraine, and we all need Ukraine to enter into the EU. Well, I must tell you, I've got a big fear, and that big fear is that European populations in the West would be so relieved after Ukrainian victory and a peace, sustainable peace, that we say, okay, now we can come back to our previous lives. We can come back to a system where we would invest very little in our defense and believe that either for those of us who have nuclear weapons or the military protection from the United States of America through NATO will guarantee security for us all the time. I think that would be a huge mistake. It will be very tempting, including for budget reasons. But that would be a huge mistake, and I think that you can be surprised in life, but it's always better if you learn from your mistakes. And so the learning lesson we are having right now, and we cost a high price for that, of course Ukraine is paying the higher price of all, is that war is back, Russia is here, and this threat is not going to disappear even after a victory. So to make a long story short, the EU, well, I'm an EU man. I grew up in the EU system, and for ages I remember that speaking about defense and military issues in the EU, including in the European Parliament, for example, was a kind of offensive, right? People would tell you, oh, we want to speak about development. We want to speak about maybe foreign affairs, but defense, no, come on, it's dirty. I think that the EU managed to react, managed to raise up, or is trying at least to raise up to the challenge. It's a bit the EU style. We are doing this only when there is no other way, when you are, joined to the wall, very close to the wall, as we say in French. But we did it, including yesterday I was seeing the president of the European Investment Bank visiting Kyiv. The European Investment Bank is now financing some dual-use equipments, which is a big news from them. So the problem is that we are not doing enough, obviously. We are not doing enough. So we have to continue to do more. We also have to integrate that, as with COVID, that for some strategic products, actually, we cannot rely on the market to function. For example, the French Minister of Army last year did reopen a factory in France to produce black powder, because we didn't have any more, because it's less expensive to buy this from, I don't know, China. what happens demonstrates that actually it's not such a good idea, that we need to produce more, we need to get more. So if we can buy this from China, good. If we can't, well, let's have our own. So we all have to do this collectively, and I think that it will be very important once this will be behind us, that Ukrainians will repeatedly stand up and speak and help us in the West not to forget, not to get back to our traditional tendencies. Maybe Mr. Trump in the US is going to help us, actually. It seems that he wants every NATO member to spend 5% of his GDP to defense. It's a huge sum, maybe it's too much, but in any case, it's clear that for the time being we are not doing enough. We still are not doing enough.
Thank you. I see hands of student. Okay, please. And if you can ask your faculty or institute, please. Name of faculty or institute.
Institute of Special Communications.
Okay, please.
Mr. Ambassador, now it's really popularization of. It's a really global problem. Is popularization of disinformation about war in Ukraine. How we can use French experience for share truthful information about war in Ukraine to all world. Thank you.
To share information about what?
One more, please.
I didn't hear really. I'm a bit deaf and old, so if you could just speak louder.
Now it's really awful problem about popularization of disinformation about war in Ukraine. How we can use French experience to share the truthful information about situation in Ukraine to all over the world.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Disinformation, well, actually, as I mentioned in my speech, we have this network which is called Vejyerom, which is dedicated in spotting what they call phenomena, but unusual use of the social network, of information networks, which can be the sign of foreign activity. So this network is actually pretty active. We had something like 300 proven phenomena like this last year in France. There have been huge attacks also on our networks, but it's a bit different. About disinformation, I think that the issue is that we have to identify trusted people who would not be trusted people by the public, who would not be officials. Because each time I would do a publication on Facebook or Twitter, I always have a crazy guy saying, well, no, it's not true, whatever. And of course, some of them might work for somebody else, namely Russia. So at one point, what we need is to identify trusted names, which can be influencers, who can be, I don't know, NGOs, who can be fact-checking, whatever, respected journalists, some people who could actually back what we are saying yes, it's true, and who can say also, no, it's not true if we are not completely right. So we have to identify the trusted networks in the system. It's not that easy. Of course, it pretty much depends on each theme, on each country, but it's good to work together. And actually, what is striking is that this scene is more and more globalized. French public. My daughter, for example, who might be your age, in Paris, actually, she reads sometimes the same tweets or the same Facebook post I do, even though we obviously live in different places and have very different contacts. So I think that we should work together on this, and we should also, and this is true for us, for the public authorities, also name things. Albert Camus used to say that to give the wrong names to things is actually to add to the sadness of the world. Each time there is a Russian attack, we have to say, okay, it's a Russian attack. Okay, it's a Russian attack against some civilian targets, and we do think that it might constitute a crime against humanity or whatever. We should always, we should do whatever is needed for the people not to get accustomed to that terrible situation, because otherwise the attention of the public seems to be drifting away sometimes. We are lucky in France because actually there is no Ukraine fatigue as there might be in some other countries, and people are still pretty much focused. It's true that less exclusively than 2 years ago or 2 years and a half ago, but still people react and people are engaged and people want to hear about this. So I think that it's a great opportunity, and that it's important for you, young people in Ukraine, to speak up about what you see, what is happening, because actually you will be far more convincing to French students than I would ever be, for obvious reasons.
Thank you. And maybe one or two questions
or
for
maybe you can give 3 questions and then I'll make a joint answer so that it's quicker.
many persons. Many 5.
As you wish.
Okay. Please.
Bonjour ou bonsoir. Je
Bonsoir.
voudrais vous remercier pour votre discours. C'était incroyable. Merci beaucoup. I'm a student of the Faculty of Linguistics here in KPI, the Department of French Language Translation. So my question is a bit, I guess, theoretical, but I'm still curious. You mentioned that sometimes the members of the EU, they have to sacrifice their own kind of interests in the name of the EU. So I wonder if when Ukraine wins the war, will it be better for the peace negotiations for Ukraine to be in the EU or to be like a lone member in this? So would Ukraine have to like sacrifice something in this to match the interests of the EU? Or maybe it would the allies would much help with the whole negotiations and we would get a better deal out of it, basically. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup et félicitations pour votre français. Hein, c'est vraiment,
Merci.
vraiment remarquable. When I was saying that sometimes EU members must sacrifice its own national proposition for the greater EU good, I was not thinking about Ukraine, and was in particular not thinking about Ukraine in peace negotiations. What I was thinking about is that sometimes, in particular when you are presidency in the EU, your interest is to demonstrate that the EU would be able to reach a compromise position on sensitive transportation or energy or whatever, all these things that we are discussing into the EU. And sometimes it's a good thing to not to try to impose too much your national interest if this is not going into the sense of the greater good. So for me, it's completely separate from the issue of negotiations on Ukraine. And I think that what is clear for me is that in any case, for the EU as an institution or a group, and for each and single EU members, maybe some would say differently, but this is what I think, we all have a strong interest in Ukraine's victory, definitely. And the sooner the better. So, of course, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And please, for you.
Hello. First of all, thank you for your lecture. And I'm from Faculty of Applied Mathematics, and I'm really interested in artificial intelligence. And I'd like to ask you about artificial intelligence. What role could possibly play artificial intelligence in the future, and for example, in security of Ukraine and whole EU? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, actually, I do think that artificial intelligence is now coming to the battlefield at the moment where we are talking. For example, the special units which are trying to get the drones down or to shoot them down, actually, they can use sometimes artificial intelligence to calculate where the drones should appear to help the soldiers to target them and to reach them. So actually, this is an ongoing process. Artificial intelligence also can be extremely useful for every kind of disinformation attack or counter-disinformation program, and so on and so forth. There is but this is a bit theoretical and it gets us away, but from our subject, but the truth is that maybe in 10 years or in 20 years, there will be lots of activities which are being done now which will not be actually useful anymore, because the AE would be able to do that quicker, and we would need people who would be able to use the artificial intelligence not to do the job that the artificial intelligence can do. Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. All this is a bit scary sometimes, because after all, we all need to be sure that human decision and human responsibility is key. So what is clear is that it will be a huge challenge. And now I have some friends who are professors in university, and they are telling me that sometimes now they have to teach their students on how to use artificial intelligence. So the idea is not to say, okay, don't use it, because people use it anyway, but to say, okay, use it intelligently, because if you just ask the question of your essay to the AE, I have 150 essays. Obviously, if you use artificial intelligence, I will recognize it, because I will have the same. However, it can help you differently if it is well managed. So I do think that we need to adapt our systems, our public system, both in education but also for public institutions, and maybe even more, maybe even also for diplomacy in reality. So this is the revolution of tomorrow, definitely. And we have known quite a few of these revolutions, but they are accelerating. That's the sense where we are. And I think the consequences of that are still pretty unclear. This is why this summit in Paris, which is not going to settle things, but is an important moment to at least be sure that we ask the good questions and we try to find ways to address that, including as far how to regulate that and how to make sure that the result of the AE that you are using are not biased by somebody or in view of some interest, be it political interest, I'm thinking of Russia again, or commercial interest, actually.
Thank you. And one question from this sector, please. For you.
Thank you. I'm a student of Faculty of Sociology and Law, and I have two short questions. First is, what is victory of Ukraine for you?
Well, a victory for Ukraine, for me, would be what Ukraine would consider a victory. That may be a bit easy, but at the end of the day, seriously, at the end of the day, it's certain we are not fighting this war. We don't have soldiers being killed in this war. You do. And so those who, the only ones who have a legitimacy to say, okay, now it's time to talk or not, it's Ukraine. And the only ones who have the legitimacy to say, okay, it's a good deal or not, it's Ukraine. We can support, we can give ideas, we can, if they are helpful and requested. But definitely, we all have to respect who is the victim here, and definitely it's Ukraine. So then the definition of victory in itself can be pretty broad, right? It can go, some people would say the only thing that Ukraine would be resisting is in itself a victory. To some extent it's true. Some people would say there would be no victory as long as Ukraine has not recovered the 1991 borders, whenever that would be. And in between you have so many, At the end of the day, it's a political decision which has to be taken by the Ukrainian authorities and ultimately by the Ukrainian people.
Okay, and the second one, maybe a half of year or maybe a year, we can hear about negotiations, about ceasefire, but imagine just we sit to speak with the Russians and they just say no. And what will France do after that, like one of leaders of a group of allies of Ukraine?
Well, we are trying to step up our efforts to support Ukraine, and certainly we will continue to step up our efforts to support Ukraine until victory, until Ukrainian victory, and as long as it will be needed and requested by Ukraine. So as long as Ukraine is not happy with the result, well, we are here. I mean, it is also we are doing this because it is your national interest, but it is our national interest too. At the end of the day, there is no French security or EU security. There is no Ukraine security. Actually, there is 1,000. Is it one or two? I'm lost now. Okay, but it's not so far away between Strasbourg and Lviv. If you look at it from. In particular, if you look at it from a Chinese eye, from a Russian eye, or from a United States eye, I mean, we are all in the same continent, yeah.
Thank you. And last maybe question from from Vice Rector of International Affairs, Andrei Shasholin.
Your Excellency, again, it's an honor for us to host your lecture here. And let me scale up. After the election of President Trump, we see that some tensions arise between EU and America. So my question, what is the future of EU-US and EU-China relations in this context?
You have easy questions for the end, Mr. Vice Rector. No, thank you very much. Well, nobody knows. Actually, I think it would be a bit an exaggeration to speak about tensions between the EU and US. There is this threat of or call for possible trade measures from the US against the EU, and the EU immediately said, okay, well, if you would do that, we would react, as we did in the past. For me, it's not a sign of weakness, actually. It's not because we are friends, but we are not aligned, right? We are allies with the United States, but we are not aligned. So, actually, well, sometimes we disagree, not the first time, actually, and sometimes in our history we disagreed strongly, including General de Gaulle kicked NATO out of France. It was a long time ago. A very different historical period. So yes, we went through some very rocky and bumpy situations. At the end of the day, we always know where we come from, and France being the oldest ally from the United States. And it reminds me of some history. It is during the missile crisis in 1962 with Kennedy. And Kennedy is, of course, worried to be supported internationally. So he sends an envoy to General de Gaulle. And the envoy is received by General de Gaulle, who is President of France at that time. And the envoy explains the situation and says why President Kennedy would appreciate if de Gaulle could voice support. And then he says, I have here maps and photographs and plans, and I can demonstrate what President Kennedy is saying. And General de Gaulle would cut him and say, I don't need your demonstration. The word of President Kennedy is enough for me. And that's it. So, you know, during important moments, you have to know where you stand, and I think we pretty know where we stand. So that's good. About EU and China, well, we have a complicated relationship because China is at the same time a solution and sometimes a problem, both a partner, a competitor, and maybe in some fields an adversary. So we have to deal into this uncharted and complicated relationships. I think that the EU is far less naive than it was during a long time, and pushing now to get, well, free treatment. I mean, if Chinese firms can benefit from EU funds for reconstruction, for example, in the Western Balkans, good, but then why EU firms cannot benefit from, you know, these kind of things? So I do think that the war in Ukraine did help to some extent the EU in getting out of a kind of naivety. You know, being naive and thinking that everybody, okay, there is a fierce competition out there. It's not going to end. At the end of the day, though, I think it's very important that we do stand for our values. And our values are certainly not that there would be a kind of world dominated by three big ensembles, who would be China, the US, and the EU. It's not going to work like that. It cannot work like that. So let's also be politically grounded. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, students, for your active position, for your questions. And Your Excellency, can I give you one present from our university? It's a stamp for. We have in the last year we have 120 years, and this stamp was anniversary. This is most famous our aviation and space constructors who worked or who studied in our university, from Ігор Sikorsky and others, very famous constructors and scientists. For you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Rector. Thank you. And I'm impressed by your students. Oh, so you are happy, huh?
No. Пан посол каже, що він дуже вражений вашими питаннями. Щиро дякую вам всім. And Your Excellency, thank you very much for this discussion, for this meeting. Maybe we can take a photo with all of us. Okay. First of all, on the okay, maybe with. Колеги, давайте станемо всі разом, напевно, якщо